Thank you, Jill. Thank you, MCASD, and the organizers and funders of the Russell Lecture. My name is Alexandro Segade, and I'm an artist and associate professor in visual arts at UCSD. I'm honored to be here tonight to introduce a personal hero and inspiration, Joey Terrill. I'm not alone in feeling that way about him, and I think about Joey's work a lot. Like, for example, 4 minutes into Bad Bunny's 2026 Super Bowl halftime, when the camera caught dancers Dan Santiago and Igor Faria grinding through the window of an open truck door. We all saw it. Queers, Latines, queer Latines, their cousins, mothers, uncles, and Republican politicians too, who threatened a congressional investigation into what they called obscenity. I will let the ironies of that hover in the room. What I want to say is that when I caught the glimpse of those two hot men dancing to a reggaeton beat on the San Francisco 49ers football field, I thought of Joey Terrill. Issue 2 of Terrill's 1978 artwork in magazine form, Homeboy Beautiful, ends with a one-page comic titled The Adventures of Spooky and Puppet. The first panel shows them in a lowrider, one in a bandana, the other in a stocking cap, mustaches bisecting their faces. Spooky and Puppet are deeply in love and face all the problems of homo homeboys everywhere, a text bubble reads. When they pull into an alley near Whittier Boulevard to make out, a woman attacks them. Jotos, cabrones, maricones, get the fuck out of my alley, you faggots, scum. Get out before I kick your ass, she yells. That was Lydia, my mom's cousin, who's my sister's comadre, says Puppet. Not safe in their own neighborhood, not even from their own families. They drive off to Hollywood, hoping to, quote, find some place where we can go and feel comfortable. The scholar Rob Hernandez calls Terrill's projects mariconography, a visual form that answers violence against queer Chicano bodies with a, quote, flamboyant set of tactics. It's a social choreography through which Terrill performs the someplace we can go that eluded Spooky and Puppet. Long before Apple Music presented a simulation of mariconography at the Super Bowl halftime, Joey Terrill risked everything to create a better world by representing his own experience of this imperfect one. Terrill's decades-long intermedia production in painting, performance, printed matter, and activism documented the realities of his autobiography, his desires, his fantasies, his politics, and the ruptures, including HIV/AIDS, that have rocked his world. Joey Terrill's work, wow. No? Okay. Here we go. Did you hear anything I said in the back?
Yes.
I'm trying to speak from my diaphragm. Joey Terrill's work has been featured in the 2023 edition of Made in LA at the Hammer Museum, Copy Machine Manifestos at the Brooklyn Museum, and the touring exhibition Axis Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano, LA. Recent solo shows include Still Here at the Marc Selwyn Gallery, Joey Terrill Cut and Paste Portstar Projects, New York, Joey Terrill Self-Portraits, Clones, Icons, and Homages, 1930 to 1993 at Parkview Paul Soto in Los Angeles. His work has been collected by the Smithsonian, MoMA, el Museo del Barrio, and the Whitney in New York, SFMOMA, MOCA LA, and the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego in La Jolla. Terrill studied art at Immaculate College in LA, which taught a curriculum designed by Sister Karita Kent, and Cal State LA. He is also associated with artist Hetty Sandoval's Butch Gardens School of Art, and was featured in a recent exhibition of this experiment in art making and pedagogy at the Vincent Price Art Museum. I often say to students, the reason to study artists who came before, especially those who were once overlooked, is to fulfill your own wishes. Joey Terrill is exactly the artist who I wished existed, and lo and behold, he does. He's here tonight. Please welcome the homeboy beautiful himself, Joey Terrill.
Wow, what an intro. I mean, I'm humbled. Anyway, hi everyone. Thrilled to be here. Glad you're here. It's an honor. And I've got a lot of images and I have a lot of stuff to talk about, so I can go kind of fast, and just buckle up, okay? So I always will start out with this image from 1975. My good friend, the artist Teddy Sandoval, and I collaborated back in the 70s. We both had the mindset that we wanted to produce what we call a maricon identity. Maricon being the slur for gay men. And this was during the time of the Chicano arts movement in Los Angeles. And you know, there was a lot of stereotypical imagery about Latino men and Chicanos, you know, whether it was like, you know, cholos, lowriders, but usually kind of macho. And we wanted to subvert that, do something different. And Teddy Sandoval did the photographs. That's me up there. I did the t-shirt. And we did a series of photos that we then did Xerox images of and put on postcards as part of the mail art phenomenon, where we would mail to artists from New York to London, and they could mail back, they could alter it. And for those that don't know about the mail art phenomenon, I'd say look it up. It's, you know, pretty cool, and I think it's still going on. But then in the following year, 1976, this is me and my friends and my cousin marching in what was called the Christopher Street West Parade in Hollywood at the time, which was, you know, the Pride Parade. And we had marched the year before, where I wore a t-shirt that said faggot, and people, you know, loved it. But by the following year, I said, you know, we need to continue with this maricon identity. And so I asked my friends, who wants to join me? If you want, I'll make you a t-shirt. So those were all hand lettered, hand done, with brown dye on yellow t-shirts, because I thought yellow t-shirt was like very cool at the time. And then for my cousin and my friend Martha, we chose Maflora, which was a slur for lesbians. And I never really knew was the term Malflora or Maflora. And my friend Martha told me, you know what, I love Malflora, a bad flower. So that's why they're Maflora. So our intention in doing this and marching back in the day was twofold. There were two audiences we were looking at. One was the mostly white, gay liberation, you know, activists that we were familiar with and I was involved with, that letting them know that, hey, us maricones, us, you know, Chicanos, brown people, we're here and we're part of this movement as well. But the other audience was for other Latinos and Chicanos, and to let them know that, hey, we are here as well and we're part of La Familia, whether you like it or not. So that's us. And then in 77, again, as part of our, you know, Maricon series, I did this series of images that sort of were looking at what you might call a punk aesthetic or a do-it-yourself or kind of zine aesthetic, where I took titles of songs or music from, you know, Latino records that we had, and then put, you know, homoerotic imagery in them. And so you see, Que bonita es mi tierra, música para ti, sabor a mí. And, you know, I've always appreciated and loved humor and satire in my work. And because I've always liked it in other artists' work. Then in 78, I came up with this idea about wanting to do a magazine. I loved popular culture. As a child, as a kid, I couldn't get enough of magazines, comic books. I mean, everything from, you know, Bugs Bunny to Photoplay magazine. I mean, I was just always loved things, but I never saw myself reflected in popular culture. And I had an idea occurred to me because there was a magazine at the time called New West Magazine. Some of you may remember that if you're old enough. And it was one that was geared towards upper middle class, you know, communities, and they had advertisements for, you know, Beverly Hills and real estate and all this stuff. But this one time they had a photo essay, and I forget the name of the photographer or the artist, and it focused on cholas. It focused on the Latina gang members. And I remember looking at it and thinking, you know, it just seems so condescending. It was almost like, look at these freaks, if you will. And so I thought, you know what, I need to make my own magazine. So this was never meant to be a zine in the traditional sense of a zine representing a specific community where people could contribute to it and, you know, submit things and put photographs and write articles. This was a art piece in a magazine format, and it was all me. I mean, I'm the cover boy on these, but in it, so I titled it Homeboy Beautiful, kind of a parody of House Beautiful magazine. And in the first one, all the way on the left, you know, I determined that I'm going to do a sort of a photojournalistic expose in each issue of Homeboy Beautiful. And that was, you know, kind of a riff on Alarma magazines out of Mexico, as well as the Inquirer in LA. And I chose as my first one a secret underground homeboy party that I played Santos, a photojournalist. I snuck a camera in and went to an underground homeboy party, which didn't exist. It was just me and my friends, and I said, hey, I want to do a photo shoot. We're going to do a homeboy party. Who's in? Come on. And we had a blast. We had such fun doing it. And in it, as I sneak in, I relate that because I'm indifferent to it. I'm just a photojournalist and I'm observing. But I said, gee, there's no women here. It's all guys. It's all dudes. It's all homeboys. And sure enough, as they got drunk, they started getting affectionate, and they started to remove their bandanas from their heads. 'Cause back then, all the homeboys were wearing bandanas, and they would place them in either their left or right, back pockets, following the gay hanky codes at the time. At a certain point, they took off the oldies but goodies, and they brought up the Judy Garland records, and were getting stoned listening to Judy Garland records. Again, it was all in fun and made up. They threw their placas on the walls. They had, their own kind of queerized names as well. And anyway, it was so much fun. It was really cool. I also had an advice column called Ask the Woodwalker. There was also a makeover. There were a lot of magazines. Cosmopolitan magazine always had some makeover, some from it. Well, we had Virginia Leibowitz, who was a librarian from Gardena. Again, just a friend from Immaculate College, and we turned her into a Jolla. And then, I had, it was mentioned previously, a Spooky and Puppet, a sort of comic strip about two homeboys trying to find their way in the world. And it was great. I only did an edition of 100. It was all do-it-yourself, and it was done with staples. And it was sold in 3 places in LA. And then the second one that I did, I chose to do an expose on East LA terrorism, which didn't exist. There were no East LA terrorists, but there were such, let's call it, it's racism, particularly in LA. A lot of people on the west side were just fearful of doing anything like east of La Brea, right? That was all where the Mexicans did, and it was dangerous and whatever. So I follow a group of terrorists. We go into Westwood and we kidnap a white man and his wife and their Japanese maid, and we tie them up and we bring them to East LA to torture them. So we tie them up, we force them to eat menudo, and they're screaming. We making them watch Channel 34. They're like, no, Spanish language channel. And then we drop them off into an alley. And again, it was very politically incorrect, and that was with intent. My source for that satire came from things like Monty Python, John Waters films, Mad Magazine. I was always looking for that kind of satire and humor to call out misogyny, violence, and I was critiquing not just the racism from the white community, I was also critiquing the violence and misogyny that I saw within the homeboy culture and the Latino community as well. So it was a double whammy as far as I was concerned. Anyway, there's more about those that I could go into. The last one, the third one, I never completed. It was going to be about homeboys in the arts, and me and my artist friends were thinking of all kinds of things we were going to do. But long story short, I broke up with my boyfriend and decided to move to New York, so I put that on the back burner. Then, when I moved to New York, I had 3 friends that were already living in New York. I was going there with no real plan. I had a couple of goals in mind. One was to exhibit my art. The other was to see John and Yoko, even if they were just walking through Central Park, I would wave to them and my life would be fulfilled. And instead, the night that John Lennon was killed, I was 4 blocks away and ran down there to the Dakota and stood out there for about 5 hours in the freezing cold, just grieving along with New York. And it was a moment, it was a pivotal moment for me. I recognized that this is something that is going to reverberate for years. I already knew about and grieved over Harvey Milk being assassinated in 1978. Here, 2 years later, you got John Lennon. Ronald Reagan had just been elected, and I just knew the 80s were going to be different. I felt like the 70s were over. What I couldn't have known at that time was that 6 months later, the first reports of 5 homosexual men with Kaposi sarcoma and cancer and pneumonia were first reported by Dr. Michael Gottlieb. In April of '81, there was an alternative art space called Windows on White Street. And essentially it was a couple of businesses there in Tribeca, and this was before Tribeca was the trendy Tribeca of today. And they would allow artists to change out monthly in their display windows. And so I had 3 windows, and the size of the windows and the number of windows determined the paintings that I did. The first one on the left is called Making Tortillas in Soho, because when we got to New York, you could not find a Mexican to save your life. We just didn't exist. I mean, all these other Latinos were there. We had, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, and you name it, they were all there. But Mexicans and Chicanos just did not have a presence in New York. And I started to really crave comida, food, and tortillas. You couldn't find a tortilla, so I called my uncle, Rudy, in LA, and asked him, give me the recipe. How do I make tortillas? And so I made tortillas where I was living at the time. And I titled it Making Tortillas in Soho, because I thought that was funny, because people come from all over the world to Soho to make art, and I come and I make tortillas. The middle one, reading the local paper, obviously is referencing, the assassination of John Lennon, which I felt I needed to commemorate on some level there. Then the third one on the right is called Searching for Burritos. And it shows me, my sister, and my other friends, and we're in the middle of a blizzard in front of the Guggenheim. And of course, we're not really searching for burritos. It's a metaphor for us searching for our culture, ourselves, our food, our art, which we did not see in New York at that time. So anyway, the end part of this is that 40 years later, these were exhibited at Ortuzar Gallery in Tribeca, 4 blocks away from where they originally were exhibited, and they're now in the collection of MoMA. So I'm thrilled about that. Then I mentioned how I had broken up with the love of my life, Rick, long story, but I was always a storyteller, and I was always doing these paintings or illustrations that were sort of comic book-like. So I did this long 10 canvases called Breaking Up, Breaking Down, which chronicled my emotional turmoil and up and down of breakup. And part of what I was doing was my influence from seeing the work of Frida Kahlo. And it's not that I was never interested in trying to replicate her style of painting. What I appreciated about her work was what I called that confessional nature, where she put it, to me, she put it all out there when I first saw her works. She put her birth, she put her pain, she put her surgeries, her emotional state of mind, her loves, all of that. And I thought, I want to try to be able to incorporate that into my work, in my storytelling. So I have here, and it ranges with starts out with a self-portrait, where it's sort of in a quagmire of gray mud, and I'm sinking. It's like quicksand, and it was a reflection of my emotional state at the time. And then it just sort of goes through these little vignettes of what it was like breaking up. Over on the upper left-hand side is a picture of Rick, and it's the little script in there is he wore Ray-Ban glasses, a Rolex watch, and he used to eat my ass. And I kind of was making fun of his desire to always have nice things, and Bunny was something that was, it turns out he was bipolar, and that was a part of it. And then I'm there masturbating because I'm missing him. And I have to tell you something. Like I'm not an artist that like a lot of my friends were, who were doing very homoerotic art. And I said, I know I could do that, but all these other people are doing it so well. Like I just wanted to do something a little bit more personal and more satirical. And that's what I did here. Taking drugs, trying to sleep, reading, and then crying. And then at the very end, it says, 1 year later, possibly. And it's this total fantasy of me, in Hollywood with the green hills, and we've got nature all around me. And then this is just a close-up of one of the canvases from that series, or whatever. This series is now acquired by the Whitney in New York. But then I was also doing works where I wanted to portray men, Latino men, Chicano men, but again, sort of going against the stereotype of the macho, attitudes and stereotype that I found in a lot of the art. I wanted to show us being sensitive, being docile, sleeping, reading, or, as in this one, it's my roommate, Orlando, and it's Orlando waiting for toast, which, has been acquired. And I used to carry a camera around my neck at the time, 35mm, and wherever I would go, I would just take tons of pictures, and then I would glean images from there that I thought would make good paintings. But I also, back in the 70s and 80s, every Chicano artist I knew would do some version of the Virgen de Guadalupe. It was sort of, it was the standard. You just, that's what one did. And I could never figure out how or what I wanted to do. But sitting down thinking with all of the feminist principles that I was getting from Immaculate Art College about, the female image, I thought, well, who is the most mysterious female image in my life? And that was my mother. And I could go into reasons for that. But I chose to do this painting of her as the Virgen de Guadalupe. And it's called Mother and Son. And the image is taken from a black and white photograph from 1957, and that's me. I was 2 years old, and we were in Cananea, Mexico, visiting my grandparents at the time. And my mother was extremely happy. She was very happy at that time. I think it was the apex of her happiness. She was a success in all the ways she had been raised to be a success. She was, she was very Catholic. She was a wife, a mother. She had a son, and she was filled with joy. Within 5 years of that photograph, she had a nervous breakdown. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenic. She was institutionalized, and that caused a lot of, as you can imagine, upheaval in my sister and my upbringing and engagement with the world and family. So I always looked at that image as one where she was at her happiest. Someone pointed out to me that if your mother is the Virgin of Guadalupe, what does that make you? I said, well, I don't know. But when I showed it to my mom, I was afraid that she was going to think it was sacrilegious. And she did say, she goes, is this sacrilegious, mijo? I said, no, Mom, I don't think so. I think it's honoring the idea of, the female image. And she goes, okay, because I love it. I said, okay. The thing about it, I'll point out, is that usually for those people that are familiar with the images of the Virgin, there's usually these little vignettes around her that show images from the story of the Indio Juan Diego seeing her, the vision of the Virgin, and him receiving the roses on his tilma. In this, I chose to put images of our life in Los Angeles. There's one off to the side that shows the headline of Robert Kennedy being assassinated. That happened in LA. And I chose that because with my mom, my sister and I learned we always had to sort of monitor and negotiate around her because we didn't want her to get upset because of her mental frailty. And she would go into a deep depression. And that was one thing that had triggered in her. The other images are of my sister getting married, which was a very happy time for us. And then down here, we see that 708. That was my address in West Hollywood where I was living at the time. But, then also, in the late 70s, Chicano artists in LA and San Francisco were learning about and paying homage to Frida Kahlo. And at the time, I knew very little about her. I had seen a documentary in a class that I monitored at LACC, and I was blown away. It was a documentary from Mexico, and it ended with showing her the funeral procession and everybody turning out for a funeral. And I was in tears. I'll be honest with you. I was a big crybaby, and but I thought to myself, how can we honor her? And I remember thinking to myself, if Andy Warhol had been born in Mexico City, this is the work that he would do. And so this was titled, If Andy Had Been Born in Mexico City, that he would have chosen Frida as opposed to Marilyn Monroe as the iconic female image. This is currently in the show Frida Kahlo, Making of an Icon, which is at the Museum of Fine Art, Houston, and is going to close the end of May, and then it's going to reopen at the Tate Gallery in London. So I'll be going to London for that. Then this image is from 1989, and it's called Remembrance. And this is when, by 1989, I was already deeply involved in the HIV and AIDS activism and advocacy work that we were doing. And people were dying all around me. Friends were dying. It was pretty horrific. And at the time, I appreciated a lot of the art that was coming out of New York and the East Village scene. David Wojnarowicz, Grand Fury, Act Up, all the agitprop, all the anger, the politics of it. But I wanted to do something about the grieving that we were going through. And I also wanted it to be centered in, or have the sensibility of being in LA, and maybe Latino or Chicano. So I chose to do this painting, and that's me in the middle. That's my boyfriend Robert at the time. He's standing behind me. And he was 9 years younger than I was. And so the friends that were dying were of my generation at that time. He was always there in a support role, but no one from his generation had started to get sick yet at that time. I chose to be carrying flowers, and it's a little enigmatic. There's no guidance on, is this being laid at a grave? Is this being part of in a garden? I think I'm not giving you direction with it. The one thing about it that I wanted to do and include is that I wanted us surrounded by this garden, which at once was beautiful, but also treacherous. You certainly didn't want to fall against any of those, that cactus and stuff. And to me, that was a metaphor, once again, for how I viewed, the sexual world at that time. That as much as I wanted to and needed to be intimate with my community and gay men, that there was all of this, sort of negotiating through all the risks and everything that was happening to us at the time. 1989 was also the year that Carlos Almaraz died, the iconic Chicano artist who I considered a friend. And it's also the year that I myself tested positive for HIV. And so there was all of those things in my head when I did this work. I also chose to put on a shirt that was my favorite shirt at the time, and it was designed by my good friend Arnubal Araica, Arnie. And I remember Arnie seeing the painting, and he said, I love that you chose my shirt. Because my design, my design will live on. And he goes, because I know I'm not going to be here. And he was right. He did die a few years later, and I'm glad that I honored it that way. Also, the birds of paradise, they're the official flower of Los Angeles, for those that don't know. And I just this year was accepted into the La Jolla mural program, And this will be going up as a mural, I think, in late April here in La Jolla. Then in 1989, 90, 91, for 3 years, I held Halloween parties in the house that I lived in Koreatown in LA. And I would take a couple of weeks to paper over my dining room walls in the living room and put all kinds of collaging and paintings and drawings and, you know, made it a very immersive sort of environment. And I would invite friends who were designers, artists, musicians, club kids, you know, punk rockers, my cousins, I mean, just all kinds of people, and we had a blast. It was so much fun. And the underlying subtext here was that everyone knew that you could come to the party, and it didn't matter if you were sick, it didn't matter how weak you were, whatever, because there was always, it was a place of comfort and home, right? I mean, as opposed to going out to a club, you know, where it's jam-packed with people and you don't feel good, that became an issue. So we partied like there was no tomorrow as a rebuke to all of the death and dying that was going on around us. And this was a boyfriend of a friend of mine, Tom Gutierrez. He came dressed as Perot the clown, and he was very athletic and swarthy, and I loved his outfit. And he also liked and did too much cocaine, and he died a couple years after this photo was taken, and I decided to commemorate him in this as part of my Halloween series. And then this is the piece that's here at the Santa Monica, listen to me, the Museum of Contemporary Art, La Jolla, and it's Jeff, Victor, Luis, and George, who were friends of mine at the party. And it was mentioned earlier by Jill that we've got Jeff Huereque, all the way on the left, and then Luis Sampao, the third figure with the white roses in his hair. They came dressed as Dos Fridas, the painting. And if you kind of can see that they had these red velvet hearts on their bosom, connected with red vinyl that looked like the veins of blood that you would see, you know, in the painting. So, and Jeff and Luis are still together after all these years. So, then this is Oscar Ernesto. This was another from the Halloween series, and the theme that year was Hell's Angels, and that's how he chose to come, in a kind of a leather harness with these big silver wings. And Oscar is a sweetheart, and he's still alive. He's not HIV positive, and he was a kindergarten school teacher, and so I loved his outfit. But you can see how I would decorate the house to be an immersive environment, and I would fill it with images from. These are photos from, I think, After Dark magazine that were looking at Fellini's Satyricon. There's also images from Robert Mapplethorpe photographs, the skulls, his lily that I would paint in glitter. There's also Baron von Bloden and other kind of queer creative images. Then this was, back when I was still doing works about Rick and I. This is titled "Not All Our Lovemaking Had to Smell of Poppers." I was trying to, jokingly indicate that, what, for all our craziness or whatever, we did love each other. We really did feel for one another, and even though we broke up after 8 years in a big dysfunctional relationship, we ended up being great friends for 30 years until he died of cancer about 10 years ago. Then, so I'm always thinking about heartbreak and breaking up and whatever. This is the last painting of Robert. That was my boyfriend at the time after Rick, and the one that was in the remembrance. And this was where I knew that we were about to break up from our relationship, and so I did this one last painting of him. And I like to think it's a really good tribute to Robert, who and I'm still good friends with him. And him and his husband now have been together for 20 years. So, then this is a painting called Wolf. Back in the 70s, a good friend of mine, Danny Ramirez, had moved to San Francisco. And because he did, there was this whole group of us that all kind of graduated from high school together. We all came out together, and there were about 10 of us, and we called ourselves Las Escandalosas. And as a crew, we would go up to San Francisco and just party and have a great time. We'd go out to the Castro, we'd go up and down the streets, we'd be in the clubs, we'd go dancing, we'd go to the Ivy, and we'd go to the bathhouses. It was really a lot of fun. But by the early 80s, things were changing. And when we would go up, it was no longer about the partying that we were seeking out to do. It was, let's spend time with Danny, because he wasn't feeling that strong. He was a little bit weak. So we'd get together, and we'd all do a potluck, and we'd get together at his home and just spend time with him. And in doing that, I had an interview magazine, which used to be a really big format for those that remember. And I was opening it up, and my friend Eddie is there with the sunglasses. And I opened up the magazine, and there was this picture of a young Matt Dillon. And me, Danny, and Eddie, at the same time, all three of us said, woof. And I thought, oh, great, I need to capture that in the painting. But then I also did, in the mid-'80s, I did this series of grid paintings. There were 9 canvases, all put together in a grid, and they were of specific new architecture or places where there was public art. And it was about me centering myself in some of those public spaces, which I knew I had no real access to. I was not, a law firm. I was not, a professional in that sense, but I knew I could traverse and be around public art. And that's me in the center. And this is the Wells Fargo building, which had it had a couple of Rauschenbergs. It had Marc Selwyn sculptures, and this was one. This is now in the collection of Hammer, MOCA, and Black. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a great new direction that they're going in. It's called MAC 3, and they are all sharing the acquisition of works, which they can then archive, do the upkeep, exhibit, and spread out the cost among all 3 museums in a collaborative nature instead of competing with each other. So, this is another one called Isamu Noguchi's California Scenario, which some of you may be familiar with, over down at South Coast Plaza, and that's when it was first in 1984, first opened. And I actually got to meet Isamu Noguchi. I was thrilled. And that's me in the middle. There we go. Then this one is a fun one. It's called Will Rogers State Beach, 1980. I was living in New York, and I painted this during the coldest winter they had in 20 years. It was a blizzard. We had 3 or 4 days with minus 20 wind chill factors. I mean, I'm from LA. I was from California, and it was a challenge, but we did it. And so I did this as a sort of thinking about California, but also I was making fun a little bit of the clone phenomena at that time in the 70s and 80s, where gay men were adapting these sorts of stereotypical archetypes of being a construction worker, a cowboy, and everyone was starting to look like the village people. And of course, there were those of us that said, we have fought through gay liberation, for us to come out and be ourselves, and come out and be authentic individuals, and yet here we are now all dressing up like these archetypes. And that's why, I did a whole series called the Clone Series, which was kind of making fun of my own community. Then this is called When I Had Blue Hair, and that's me in 1984. And I'm posed there in front of MOCA, which had yet to open. I was so excited about MOCA opening. It was the year of the Olympics, and it hadn't quite opened yet, but I decided to do a portrait of myself about 15, 16 years later, I worked at MOCA for 2 years, which was really cool. And now I'm in their collection. This is me and Robert watching Straight Jacket. And, you know, again, this is my boyfriend Robert at the time. And it was a time when there was all of this anxiety and fear about all of the death and dying that was going on around us because of AIDS. And I remember us sitting while watching Straight Jacket, the movie from the early 60s, I think, which starred Joan Crawford, and you know, it was she cuts off her husband's head with an axe, and I thought, oh, this is supposed to be scary, but it's not really scary. But I had us there watching it, and I envisioned having these gay angels watching over us, you know, keeping us safe. Oh, and that's now in the Cantor's Art Center at Stanford. Then it makes me think you don't like me or something, 1988. And that's me in the center. And I'm surrounded by a collage of every homophobic, anti-gay, you know, anti-lesbian article, newspaper, you know, photographs, things that I could find, and just surrounded myself with that. Unfortunately, it's almost, you know, calm compared to what's going on today and the attack against the LGBT community, especially the T community. But you know, that's another lecture. Anyway, this was something that I felt was my way of projecting out to the greater community about, you know, look what's happening to us. And because a lot of people were indifferent to it. This, along the same lines, this is my patron saint praying for my immune system. And I apologize because this image is sort of chopped off at the bottom here, and I didn't realize the presentation. But in the lower corner there, you see that little Z? And there's an image of me asleep with the Z's, because I'm dreaming this. And my patron saint was San Martin de Porres, known as the Black Saint. He was a Peruvian saint. And he was he was known for taking care of the sick and the dying. And he would clean their rooms, he would wash their hair. So he's the official patron saint of hairdressers. And he would always picture holding a broom. And back then, the Vatican did an edict on homosexuality, which is collaged in the Herald up above. It's from the New York Times. And essentially, the Vatican was saying that with all these people coming out and being open, whatever, one would have to understand the reaction from people who would bash. Essentially vindicating or saying that bashing was to be expected. So I have San Martin being so angry that he puts down his broom and he decides to pray for my immune system. The person who posed for that was my coworker, Roberto Herrera, who was a case manager at the Center for the Partially Sighted, where I worked, the vision impaired. And within 3 years, he also died of AIDS. Then this is The Good Sodomite. This is from 2011. Wow, time flies. So I was watching television, and within one day, I heard the reference of, you know, sodomy. Oh, how bad that was, right? That, you know, and I remember thinking, God, was everybody from Sodom a bad person? I can't believe that, you know, whatever. It's always been used as a slur. And at the same time, later in the afternoon, I think I heard someone refer to the Good Samaritan, which I always grew up with. And yeah, the Good Samaritan. Well, I inverted that. I titled this The Good Sodomite. This is based on an 18th century stained glass window, and I should know the name and whatever, but I don't right now. And I inverted it so that I have the traveler who was you know, robbed and left, you know, there to die, being consoled by a sodomite. And the artist Barry Morse in Los Angeles was the model for this one. And it did lead me to think of doing a series that might be based on on stained glass imagery, which was used obviously, throughout Europe to tell stories. Then in 2005, I recognized, because my doctor and I theorized that I was infected with HIV in 1980 when I lived in New York. It was ground zero for infection at that time, and I didn't get tested until '89. At that time, the prevailing thought was that HIV lays dormant for 10 years, and then it becomes AIDS. So I did the math. I said that was 9 years ago, so I have 1 year before I developed AIDS. That was my mindset. It was hard to get rid of that mindset considering what was going on around us. But I also recognized that I would now be living with HIV longer than I had my previous 25 years. So it started me thinking about imagery and photographs from New York when I lived there in 1980, and I culled from those photos sources for paintings. And this was called my last day in New York. And when I lived there, I was working at Conrad's, English department store, and my two friends, John and Laura, had said they knew that I was going to be returning to LA, and they said, "Hey, did you ever go to Fire Island?" I said, "No, I never did." And they said, "Come on, we're going to take you down there." So on that Sunday before I flew back to California, they took me over there, and I was very contemplative. I was thinking about, I'm going back to California, I'm going back to a relationship, we'll see, blah, blah, blah. But, they were taking photographs of me, and I didn't even really look at some of those photographs until all those years later, where I said, you know what, this is going to be an image that I'll put in this painting. And this is another in that New York series. This is called My Mother's Maiden Name. At the time, my boyfriend Rick and I were walking through Soho, and we came upon one of the ironwork buildings that was there, and someone had scribbled Mendoza in chalk. And I said, "Oh, Rick, take a picture of me. I'm going to send this to my mom." I was feeling a little homesick, and so he took that picture. Me never thinking that, 20, 30 something years later, that I would use that image for a painting, but I did. So I consider this my New York series. I also was looking at the size of these works as what I called my movie screen size. Because I was thinking, okay, I don't have the wherewithal or the resources to make a movie, but hey, I can paint like scenes from a movie. And that's what I was thinking in my head. Then this is Justine Jurgen. This is a collage work, 1993. And it references my first crush when I was in first grade at St. Pius X School in Santa Fe Springs. And that was Paul Brilhart. He was a blonde little boy with big ears, and I just thought he was adorable. And and again, when you're that age, I wasn't thinking in terms of gay, homosexual, this, that, or the other. I wasn't even thinking about sex. I just thought he looked so cuddly. I wanted to hug him, and I sort of wrote that story up there about him, and then incorporated images from our school pictures, as well as crushes that I had at that time later on with Richard Gere. Put that in there. I'll just fast forward here a little bit, just FYI, because I'm sort of, I get a kick out of this. In 2019, I was doing a presentation at the Fowler Museum at UCLA called Through Positive Eyes, in which those of us living with HIV got together as a group. We took photographs of our environment and then did a presentation, to audiences. The facilitator from the Fowler, David, had said, "Oh, can you come in? I know you're not scheduled to do this on this Sunday, but could you come in? Because my brother's going to be coming in. I want him to see this." I was like, "Okay," and I didn't know who his brother was, and he said, "Yeah, his name's Richard," and I said, "You're David Gere, so Richard Gere?" He said, "Yeah, that was his brother." I mean, I didn't have a clue, so I got to present to Richard Gere and his wife about my journey, my story, living with HIV. It was a thrill for me in a way I can't even begin to talk about. But then this was the end result of my developing the next stage of my first crush. So this starts out with it's collage work, and it starts out again with Paul, Paul Brillhart in the middle, and then surrounded by me, just being goo goo gaga over him, and then sort of radiating out with images from, the men on TV that I saw everyone from, Ricky Nelson, James Dean, Tab Hunter, and then high school crushes, all the way out, to boyfriends, and then models and porn actors. But through it all, I start out with the Beatles. That circular thing, that's the Beatles going all the way around and all throughout. When I first saw the Beatles, when I was 8 years old, I was in love. I just thought, oh my God, I remember seeing them on Ed Sullivan, with those of you that are old enough, you might remember that. And my mom was just perplexed. She said, "Why are you crying?" I said, "Mom, I can't explain it. I just love the Beatles." So, but again, it was this awareness that, oh yeah, okay, I'm not like the other kids. Anyway, this is now in the collection of MOCA, and it's currently on display. If you get down to LA, you can go see it. Then this is my start of my still life series, 1997 to 98. In 1996, I tested undetectable for the first time. And that was something that was just, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had, up until that moment, always expected that I was going to die from AIDS. There was nothing to prove otherwise. There was nothing that showed me any different. My friends were all dying. I was working with people in hospice. It was all around me, and it seemed inevitable. And my fear, my anxiety, my depression was that my mother and sister would have to grieve for their son and brother. Turns out I've outlived them both, which is a whole other story. But I was perplexed because while I was glad that I was living now and not going to die from HIV because of these medications, I've always been an advocate for against the price gouging of the pharmaceutical industry. And that's something that I know everyone is aware of how that works. And we used to go and shut down the Gilead booth at the United States Conference on AIDS. We would protest because the same drugs that were costing $10,000 a year here in the United States were being provided at $400 in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries, and they were still making profits. So I had this ambivalence about living in the age of the AIDS cocktail. But I couldn't figure out what image could I use to make work about that. I had so many conflicting emotions over it. And it was while I was sitting at my breakfast table with my Cheerios and my HIV meds that I thought, God, this looks like a Tom Wesselman still life. I've always loved his pop art still lifes from the 1960s, which to me always were both a combination of a celebration of a critique of American consumerism. And I thought, perfect trope for me to try to make about HIV and these products which keep me alive. I decided though that I was going to Mexicanize and queerize my still lifes. So no one would mistake them for Tom Wesselman, that's for sure. So I follow the same recipe or formula each time I make one. They always start out with the tabletop in the foreground with a sarape or variation of the bright colors of a sarape blanket. And then I started out by actually putting the medications in capsules directly onto the canvas. And then later, as the series evolved, I started making my own versions of them, painted, sometimes built up three-dimensionally. These pieces are, to me, a sort of a back and forth about what is real, what is not real. There's a lot of materiality there. When you see them in person, it really shows up. You don't get that by looking at them here. But it was also about centering and putting the conversation about HIV and AIDS front and center in a domestic setting. At the time, people did not want to talk about it. People were afraid of it. Excuse me. So I was determined to put that into the series, and I think I was successful in that. Here I was taking this domestic setting, a tabletop, right, with a lot of things that people could relate to and respond to. Coca-Cola, baking soda, chocolate, Cheerios, roses. but what are those pills? And that's where the conversation would start. Well, those are HIV medications. Oh, and what I found was that there were people that were, there were two groups of people. Those of us that knew about HIV or ourselves were infected, and or had people that we were being caregivers to in our family, and everyone else. People didn't know about it. It wasn't something that they talked about. They didn't want to talk about it. They feared it. So I wanted to go ahead and place that right into the art that could jumpstart a conversation around it. So, this is still like a Crix event. And when I first got tested in '89, they didn't have antiretrovirals at the time. And the reason I got tested was because the medical community was changing its view of you don't have to wait till you get sick to start taking medications that could actually mitigate or lessen the onset of AIDS. And I thought, well, that makes sense, so I'll go ahead and do that. So I was enrolled in a clinical trial, the Crixavan at UCLA, and I found the side effects. One was that, believe it or not, I lost all the hair on my legs. My legs are, and they've never returned. They're smooth, and it was a result of the Crixavan, but also it gave me kidney stones. Okay, and when the doctor had told me that the pain of kidney stones is second only to childbirth, I had a whole new appreciation for mothers and women like I never had before, and I had to stop taking the medication, and I still had the pills, the capsules, which technically that bottle was about $10,000 worth of medicine, and so I kept it because at the time there was also this network of people in the AIDS community that would share and pass on medications to people if somebody couldn't afford it, or somebody for some reason they lost their prescriptions or whatever. We knew we could assist one another with that. But I ended up putting them into my still life. The other part to this that I'll share is that Rick and I used to hang wall covering back in the early 80s. And we did these real high-end jobs, 40, 50, 60 rolls of paper, and we did all these mansions and big homes from Beverly Hills to Palos Verdes, Montecito, Santa Barbara, Whittier, and there was inevitably a roll or two of wallpaper left over, and the designer or the clients would say, "Oh, just toss it." And I would say, "Oh my God, this paper's so beautiful." I say, "They go, oh, take it, keep it." So I said, one day I'm going to figure out where I could use this wallpaper in art. I could never figure it out, so for 50 years I carried these rolls of wallpaper with me from garage to studio to apartments, wherever I lived. And then when it came time to do the still lifes, I thought, perfect opportunity. Here's an imaginary, unreal still life. The perspective is all off. Things are, not based on like real dimensions. We get its actual real wallpaper. And I'm talking high-end jobs. We did Sylvester Stallone's, we did Joan Rivers, Lily Tomlin, and then a lot of people that we wouldn't recognize their names, but they are the heads of major corporations, so this was the first one in that series. Then this is another one from 2000 called Still Life with Zara, which was a part of the Pacific Standard Time show here at the museum. And in this, I'll just show that I've also included a calendar, calendario, which was from when I was a member of VIVA, the gay, VIVA, we call ourselves the Gay and Lesbian Latino Artists Organization. And whether we were doing videos, poetry, painting, sculpture, we were a group in LA that was 5 years of some of the best times of my life. And but we got a grant, and I did a calendar that was similar to the calendarios that you find in the barrio. You find them in restaurants or bakeries or bars, and they're usually some image by Jesus Alguera referencing the Aztec mythology at the time. So I did a parody of mine, and you can see up there, it says, "Apoya tu hermanos con VIH," support your brothers with HIV. And in it, I have, the young Indian, or Indio, and he's still alive, and I have the warrior kind of standing over him. The thing about this, I'll state, is that when we took this to the printers who actually printed calendarios, we were afraid that they were going to say, no, we can't do this, it's queer, it's too gay, or whatever. And instead, they said, we love it, and they doubled the order for us. We got to distribute it throughout. It went to TJ, it went to San Diego, it was throughout LA. Then this is Blackjack 2008. I did 3 still lifes that focused on the individual, drugs that were part of my 3-drug cocktail at the time. So there was Xerit, Norvir, and Reatas. And so this one is on Norvir. And I decided to start to incorporate male images in the works. And these were images from guys that I was either communicating with and or hooking up with from the online websites. I would use the images they provided, which they were usually men of color, and they wouldn't show their faces. They were on the down low. And I knew in my years of activism and advocacy for HIV that being on the down low was one of the driving factors behind high infection rates within the communities of color. So I incorporated those in here. And again, I'm playing with humor, and throughout the still lifes, there's a lot of sexual innuendo. If you want to look for it, it's there. Just because I wanted the art about AIDS to be frivolous, fun, positive, and that's what I was trying to do here. Then this is probably the big giant masterpiece of the still life series. And it's called Just What Is It About Today's Homos That Makes Them So Different, So Appealing. And this is a huge diptych, which is now in the Williams College of Art Museum in Massachusetts. And way over in the corner, in the background, you see 2 men going at it, having a great time. And for me, it's like, yeah, that is what I find appealing. But I also was thinking of it in terms of that is why we're so appealing as targets by the homophobes, the right wing, all of the above. The other thing about this is that this was the title is a parody of a collage work that was considered the start of pop art by Richard Hamilton. And in it, it was called "What Is It About Today's Homes That Makes Them So Different, So Appealing?" And I tweaked the word to homos. This is a bigger piece. Again, it's 2008, and in this is Reatas. It was just the one blue pill. And by this time, Reatas was a component or part of an HIV cocktail to keep those of us that have the virus alive and undetectable. But it was also now approved by the FDA for PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. So individuals who are HIV negative could take PrEP and not have to worry about getting infected with HIV, which I thought was good. And that's why I have the gentleman in front with his fist up, showing his bicep. And in the back, in the corner, you can see there's someone waiting for him in the background there. Again, wallpaper. And then here's the third one, called The Sweeter the Juice, 2003. And again, everything that I just said about the still lifes applies to this as well. And here's another. This is Still Life with Forget-Me-Nots, 2012. And by this time, I started to realize that with the still lifes, I was being very repetitive. I try to make each one as different visually as possible, certainly with materiality, colors, perspectives. But I also thought, I could start to do these still lifes and change some of the subtext. And I started to do them to honor artists who died of AIDS. So up in the corner is a piece by David Wojnarowicz called One Day This Kid. It's one of my favorite works, I think from 1990. And it's up there, and it's a picture of him. I think he's 8 years old. And the text on there says, one day this kid, will grow up. He will find a sensation between his legs, and blah, blah, blah. One day this kid will find that, the negativity coming from, priests and teachers and society, blah, blah, blah. And I always loved that piece, so I paid homage to him there with that. The other part to this is that I put forget-me-nots. First of all, I liked the title of the flower, forget-me-nots. Traditionally, it was used in marriage bouquets back in the day, Victorian times especially. And this was at the time of marriage equality. And I was one of those people that, while I celebrated that marriage equality was now the law of the land, I also knew, hey, don't forget about HIV and AIDS. It still is here. It's still impacting communities of color. And again, we paying homage to David Wojnarowicz. And in the bouquet of forget-me-nots, they're usually tied with the blue or white ribbon. I chose a red ribbon. Then another collage work that I did, so I used to tell folks that I stopped counting after 50. After I knew 50 people who had died. It was just so overwhelming, I couldn't even keep count anymore. And I would do these periodic collage works that took a section of the Caravaggio painting, The Entombment of Christ, where the dead human Christ is being laid in his tomb, and Nicodemus and I think Mary Magdalene are there at the grave. And I just took this section that showed the dead Christ, and in 2023, I decided, you know what, let me just do all 50. And I did this diptych with the 50, and I did choose to leave this side open, flat, because it continues. The other part to this is that I like to think that, obviously, doing a trope off of the Warhol, but in making all these different colors, while they are all the same, every one of them is unique, certainly in terms of their color, and that's the way I felt about people living with HIV and AIDS. It was my view that just as the dead human Christ deserved our empathy, sympathy, grieving, that every person who died from AIDS should receive the same kind of treatment. So that's 50 Christ. Then I'm gonna stop here. This is the last one I'm gonna show you. This is my most recent painting that I finished in 2025. The last painting I did last year. And it's for an upcoming show that I'm doing at Marc Selwyn Gallery in May. And it's titled Chisme, East LA, 1984. And it's me and Marisela Norte. And we were at a function that was a video event by OSCO. The OSCO, Performance Arts Group, that, if you don't know about them, look them up, you'll find it interesting. And we were not the stars of the video, we were just, on the sidelines, we were in the background. And that was us. And anyway, I'm doing other works that follow in the Chisme tradition as well. So anyway, that's it, thank you. So, there's a couple of questions here that people are asking, and some of them I think I may have already answered in my presentation. As someone who's a very queer young artist myself at UCSD, how do you think your life, your troubles, achievements, memories affected your artistic practice? Well, that's how, and I'm a storyteller, and I didn't obviously, none of us chose to do work about AIDS. But when it hit, it was inevitable. I'm painting my friends, my community, lovers, family, friends, and when everyone started getting sick and dying and I became active, it was inevitable that I started to make art about it. So someone asked here about I did a series of maps, drawn maps, since the age of 12 to about the age of 22 or so. That it's called my Los Diablos series. I was fascinated with maps. I always drew maps. But I did this number of maps and variations that I called Los Diablos instead of Los Angeles. And I put all these streets, but I would name the streets after Frida Kahlo, Walt Whitman. But I listed, I was I was such a nerd. I put art galleries, movie theaters, schools, universities. I put subway stops. I labeled everything on these maps, never ever expecting to show them to anyone. That was my own private, personal thing. And apparently they were presented at the Orange County Museum of Art at the California Biennial, and people responded to them. So that's so this was somebody from the curatorial team for Orange County Museum of Art, and they say that was one of their personal favorites. And I'm thrilled because I never expected that for anyone to see that. That was my own private, kind of like a diary, visual diary. Somebody asked here, how do you navigate your cultural and queer identity during the AIDS crisis and now as a Mexican during today's ICE protests? Okay, that's an interesting question. I mean, for me, my role as an advocate is part of my identity and who I am. When I was in high school, I was a volunteer for La Huelga, working with the Cesar Chavez Great Boycott, and we would go and get people to sign petitions at supermarkets to boycott Ralph's Markets for selling non-union lettuce and grapes. People would either thank me, sign it, sometimes they'd say, go back to Mexico, or they'd spit at me. So I was already, as a young person, very involved with wanting to advocate on behalf. Kind of like Jane Fonda. But then when it came time for gay liberation, that was a natural segue. And those experiences as a young person really benefited me when it came time to be an advocate around HIV and AIDS, because that's what was necessary. I looked at the crisis that was going on as a war, and I felt like I was going to roll up my sleeves and fight the war. I was not a doctor, I was not a medical professional, I could only do what I could do, and I'm doing the same thing currently with the political chaos that we're going through in this country. Let's see, what else do they say here? What are some of your biggest tips when making connections as a contemporary artist? What was it like hosting your first exhibition? Oh, that's an interesting question. My first exhibition was probably in 1974 or 5, and I exhibited silk screens that I did from Immaculate College when I was a college student. And and it was just a small exhibit, but I felt like that was the first step towards all these years later what I'm doing now. Let's see. How do you connect a piece or series to the composition and materiality that best translates it? How do you decide what material to use? Well, the main series of works that I've done where materiality and composition are front and center has been the Still Life series. And one of the things that I loved about doing that series, and I continue to do them, is that unlike the painting, where I have one image, and I sort of basically know that's the blueprint for what the painting is going to look like, and I adapt that image to the painting and determine what I put in, what I leave out, basically, but there's just that one image. With the still lifes, I can have as much fun as I want. I can choose to put things in, in exaggerated, ways. I can clash. They're intentionally garish. I'm well aware that the still lifes are not, serene. They're not, contemplative. They're very, very garish, loud, with intent. I don't know if that answers their question. Let's see. Is art meant for the artist or the viewer? When is the context behind a piece necessary for the audience? That's an interesting question. I don't know that I know the answer, but all I know is that I've always wanted to just do my art, and then I let people determine what they like, don't like, or what pathway they get to appreciating the work. I'm going to get this wrong. Somebody said, and somebody here probably knows, who was it that said, I don't think it was Oscar Wilde, I think it was an artist who once said a quote, something like, art is too important to be taken seriously. And that's always stayed with me, and I thought, yeah. And so one thing that I've always liked to do, enjoyed doing, and I recommend this to when I talk to young students, is go look at art, go look at other people's art, but go look at art that you don't think you're gonna like. Go look at 18th century portraiture, you know, go look at English landscape paintings, whatever. You will learn about yourself as the viewer, and that can inform yourself as an artist. I mean, that's something that I think is important. I don't know, maybe that's about the question.
Conclude there.
Okay.
All
Oh,
right.
now, I don't know, does anyone here have a question? Is that, we can do a live one.
We're not supposed to ask.
Pardon?
We're not supposed to ask you questions.
Oh, you're not supposed to ask me questions? Okay. All right. All right.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.